Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to K&L Gates Technology Briefing and Outlook for over the next 2 years. My name is Bart Gordon. A brief introduction. In 1984, when Al Gore ran for the United States Senate, I succeeded him in the House. 26 years later, I retired, fortunately undefeated and unindicted, and then I joined K&L Gates and have been here for the last 10 years. During that time in Congress, among other things, I was chairman of the Science, Space, and Technology Committee, as well as being a senior member of Energy and Commerce. Just a few sort of rules of the road. Gosh, we've all done this so many times, but you're familiar with the chat line. And so we're going to give you some information for some very informed colleagues. And then we will move on to questions. And so put your questions in the chat line. A quick information about K&L Gates. We are the world's largest fully integrated law firm. We are located on 5 continents and have a large bicameral bipartisan office here in terms of policy here in Washington. So let me start off. Unless you have been fortunate enough to be in a coma for the last week, you know sort of where we are. You know that former Vice President Joe Biden is likely to be sworn in as our president in January 20th of 2000. You know that the Senate Republicans have 48 seats locked up, and 2 more likely to be coming in here shortly, and that after over $13 billion spent in this last election, you're going to have to get out your checkbooks one more time, because on January the 5th, there will be 2 more Senate elections down in Georgia, which will decide the majority there in the United States Senate. In the House, it's still, votes are still coming in. Real Clear Politics says that there is, at least at this time, a Republican pickup of 5 seats that could go up as much as double before it's over with. And so let's talk a little bit about leadership races, because they come up early. The leaders of the House and Senate know that they want to have their elections early before people start to get other opinions. And so already this morning, the majority leader in the House, Schumer, and his team has been reelected. And as expected, he has expanded that. Senator Cory Booker and Catherine Cortez Masto were added to that leadership team. So then you get to the House, where it's going to be a little trickier. Let me say that I have known Nancy Pelosi since 1980, when she was chairman of the Democratic Party in California, and I was in Tennessee. And then I guess served with her almost 24 years in the Congress. There's no better vote counter than Nancy Pelosi. And having served with known every speaker since Tip O'Neill, my opinion is she is the most effective, particularly when there are small margins. When everybody gives Tip a lot of credit, but he had over 100, Democrats to spare. And so when there was a vote coming up, there really wasn't any whip count. It was just, do what you want to do. We got enough. And so that was a different day. Nancy is often, and she is portrayed as this California liberal. But the fact of the matter is, she really is a moderating factor in the House caucus. She knows how to count. She knows how far you can push things. And she's the one that goes to the more progressives and says, this is the best we can do. If I can vote for it, you can vote for it. And I can tell you that conversation is going on right now. I went through painfully number of House caucus meetings where after elections, particularly if things didn't turn out as well as we would like, there is a constant conversation about, or conversation is a nice word. It's a little bit louder than a conversation between those folks that said, well, if we had been more progressive, if we had, we'd have turned out our base. The moderates will come in and say, hey, you win elections, by winning the medal. And the fact of the matter is, they're really all talking about what Tip O'Neill said, and that is all politics is local. We see our sort of the national scheme about how we see our local politics, and that's what's going on right now. And this is going to be the speaker's, the Nancy Pelosi's toughest election, but she knows how to count. And I think what you'll see is there'll be this time for generational change. And interestingly, with Joe Biden being, I guess, the oldest president to be sworn in at 77, he's a spring chicken in compared to the House leadership that are in their 80s. So you can make a case. You can make a case for generational change, but you still have to have. You can't beat, as they say, somebody with nobody. Steny Hoyer, really, who would love to be speaker and would be a wonderful speaker, can't really make that generational change. The heir apparent, Hakeem Jeffries, has already said that he's not going to challenge the speaker. Now, quite frankly, that's sort of dependent upon the wheels not coming off. I think he would take a draft. But in all likelihood, Speaker Pelosi will create a few more junior spots, will make a few more deals. She will hate to, but she will limit herself to just one more term, this current term. And because she doesn't want to be a lame duck, understandably, but I think that's something that she's going to have to do. And so at the end of the day, by the hair of her skinny, the chinny chin chin, I think she will slip by. And probably what will make the difference is, I would say that Joe Biden is on the phone with her right now, begging her to run again, saying, I need your stewardship for these first 2 years. This is going to be a wild ride. I need you there. And she's going to say, okay, Joe, so you're going to make some calls for me? I have a list for you. And he'll say, yes, ma'am. And that probably will be, the last bit that gets her over. But this will be her toughest election. Another thing I will just reflect on now as we're looking at a difficult economy. I went through the last crisis. And interestingly, one thing that the speaker said that was important to get through this, and she said it this way: science, science, science. And what she meant was that you have to invest in science to create innovation. Innovation then creates new products and jobs. And that's part of the way to get out of this. And I think that Joe Biden, he shares that same kind of opinion. So you're going to see, I think, a much increase in research funding as we go through the COVID and through the appropriation bills. And currently I'm working with a high-level group of scientists and science organizations. And one of the recommendations that we're going to make is that OSTP, the Office of Science and Technology Policy, that director be elevated to the cabinet level, so there can be some coordination in that area. And so I think you're going to see science and technology and innovation is going to be high on the agenda in this coming year. But being high on the agenda also puts you high on the radar. And there could be some problems with that. Bruce Hyman will talk a little bit later, I think, about the techlash and what you might be expecting there. So my colleague, Jeff Denham, a fine Republican from California, why don't you tell us, you can correct me or give addition to what I had to say about the political situation currently.
Well, thanks, Bart. Appreciate your introduction here. Let me first start by saying I have now been at the firm just a little over a year now. Spent 8 years in Congress, 8 years in the California State Senate. While in Congress, I chaired the Rail Pipelines and Hazardous Materials Subcommittee on Transportation Infrastructure, as well as the Economic Development, Emergency Management, Public Buildings Subcommittee. And in the State Senate, I chaired the Veterans Affairs Committee and the Agriculture Committee. Here at K&L Gates, I have spent a lot of my time focused on the transportation and infrastructure area, which I'm planning on talking a little bit about today. But first, let me tell you where I agree with my colleague. I would agree that Nancy Pelosi can count votes. She is really, really good at it. In 2010, she had a tough time after Republicans took the majority. 2 years ago, she really had a tough time, even though she had some larger margins. Mr. Gordon talked about the House Republicans picking up 5 seats. AP is now called 8 flips. 8 flips from Democrat to Republican, one Republican to Democrat. So we're at a +7 right now, and we will most likely pick up 6 to 10 more. You've got 4 outstanding in New York, 3 outstanding in California, 1 in Iowa, 1 in Utah. We could easily get to 10, but I think at a minimum you get to 6, which gives you 13. Nancy Pelosi could be at a 4 or 5 vote majority, which when you're counting votes, now you're really, really counting. I mean, this is getting to be the point where it's razor thin. And I think it not only creates challenges as they go through their leadership and rules, but also as we move forward on omnibus or a CR, it's really going to depend on House, on how they are able to put together votes. And because most of the seats the Republicans picked up were moderate seats, that means you're going to have even a much bigger fight between moderates and progressives. So I agree with Bart. She is a tremendous vote counter. If anybody can pull those two sides together, it'll be Nancy Pelosi. But I remember the challenges Republicans had between moderates and Freedom Caucus. So, this is certainly let the games begin. On top of that, Bart did touch on the Senate. We do have 2 Senate seats in play. Why that is important is I think it goes beyond lame duck to a stimulus package. Whether or not we get a stimulus package, I think will greatly depend on the 2 U.S. senators from Georgia, on whether or not they need something in the next month, whether they need a stimulus package, whether the country needs it, but certainly, as they would need it to be able to have something that they can champion. The Senate will be our backstop, assuming we hold at least 1, if not 2 of those seats, which means things like the new Green Deal, court packing, some of the radical tax issues that were originally talked about. Having the Senate as a backstop is something that will hold a lot of those issues back. But where I think there's going to be a lot of common ground, obviously COVID relief. We need to move forward on a vaccine. We need to move forward on getting people back to work. I would expect another package of PPP money. But on top of that, that could be in the same package as a stimulus package for infrastructure, which could include everything from expanding the highway bill and rail and ports, but also 5G, hospitals, schools. It could be the biggest infrastructure bill we've ever seen, including a number of tech areas, autonomous vehicles, autonomous trucks. Autonomous trucks are continuing to get more and more support in the U.S. As we've had a huge shortage of truck drivers, a lot of rail innovations, new testing that has been done by Hyperloop to show that they can now have humans in that type of technology, higher speed rail. So I would expect a lot of innovation to be also in the stimulus package. But I think a lot of things are hinging not only on the slim majority that the Democrats are going to hold in the House, but also the big Senate race that is going to be like no other that we're going to see in January. With that, let me turn it over to my good friend, Bruce Hyman. Bruce?
Well, thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Bart. So I'm going to talk about the impact on this on the information technology industry, and there's sort of good news and bad news. The good news is there is likely to be greater spending on and investment in technology. The bad news is that I think we can expect a whole lot more regulation. So I don't know how many of you out there are country music fans, but there's this great country music song that says, "I was country before country was cool." I like to talk about I was doing cyber before cyber was cool. Been at it since 1990. I've been involved in the major bills along the way. And thinking about the bad news in techlash right now, it's not so much that it's bipartisan, it's that it's nonpartisan. there's just a heck of a lot of both Democrats and Republicans that have a problem with big tech, sometimes for the same reasons, oftentimes for different reasons. So I'm going to quickly look at a couple of areas, a handful of areas where I think we can expect to see more regulatory activity. Those are competition policy, net neutrality, Section 230 liability protection, data privacy, and encryption. But before I do, I want to highlight two trends that I think have accelerated under COVID and that are adding fuel to the techlash fire and that will resonate with a Biden administration. The first is just growing digital dependence. I mean, during the pandemic, it's ISPs, it's cloud providers, it's wireless and backbone companies, data centers, internet gaming, social media, and messaging platforms. They've all truly become essential industries. Now, you all know this, but along with this increasing recognition has come, I think, also increasing concern about these companies' ubiquity and dominance in our lives. And the second trend that's been revealed during this pandemic has been the growing digital divide. With workers and students at home and the lack of reliable, affordable, fast internet and broadband service in rural America and inner cities, it's really magnified the differences with the rest of the country. So let's talk about that first area where I think we're going to see activity, competition policy. For some, big tech is bad simply because big tech is big and not subject to government regulation, full stop. But for others, perhaps most others, the complaints are about companies abusing their dominant position to unfairly advantage themselves or exclude others. And the central allegation is that companies that are broadly defined as platforms should not also be allowed to be participants in their markets. Now, the allegations include, think about Google with search and advertising, its special relationship with Apple, Facebook buying smaller potential rivals, think Instagram, WhatsApp, or using data to advantage its advertising, and Amazon learning about the products it sells on its platform and then offering its own products. So in the last year, we've seen extensive congressional critical hearings. The House Energy and Commerce Committee released the 400-page plus report detailing alleged abuses. And more recently, you've got DOJ suing Google and the FTC are reportedly on the cusp of suing Facebook. Now, as a legal matter, what's the legal matter? That antitrust law should be more than just about consumer welfare, meaning low prices, which has been sort of the bedrock of antitrust law for the last few decades. Democratic critic Senator Blumenthal sort of summed it up. He said, adverse consequences are not always reflected in higher prices. He said there could be less choice of products, there could be less potential future competition, and there could be a loss of privacy. And that has not been the prevailing judicial view, but that's certainly going to resonate, I think, with the Biden administration. So will they pursue a more aggressive approach? Well, the Democratic platform and the campaign's unity statement reflecting the input of Senators Warren and Sanders called for very tough action against tech, as well as pharma and healthcare and agriculture. You can expect the House Energy and Commerce Committee to continue pushing hard. Bart Gordon served on that for many years. I think he would agree with me. And interestingly, I think, as Jeff would agree, you're going to see continued support for that position among some, including the leadership of the Senate Judiciary Committee and its antitrust subcommittee. Now, suits proceed or others don't. There's definitely a chill in the air. And I think tech companies with leading positions in their sectors are really going to have to be extremely careful about taking certain actions, even if they would improve the consumer experience, the efficiency of their operations, or their competitive posture vis-a-vis foreign companies. So a second area is net neutrality. Let's go back to the future. Recall that the Obama administration, FCC, ruled that the Telecom Act also gave it authority over ISPs. And the headline was to protect against blocking and throttling and paid prioritization. But it also opened the door to price and other regulation. The Trump administration reversed course. I expect the Biden administration to reverse course yet again and to renew this quest. Now, hopefully, if it does so, it will use a scalpel and not a sledgehammer. And of course, any new regulation would have to be justified by the full APA notice and comment rulemaking. So it's going to take some time for all of that to play out. The third area, which has been in the headlines recently, is Section 230 liability protection. Now, Many say that it's been essential to the growth of the internet, both for good and for bad. Enacted as part of the Communications Decency Act, it was intended to immunize companies who take good faith actions to limit or remove objectionable content. It also shielded companies that not taking down comment that others find objectionable. And the Republicans have been excoriating Twitter and Google, Facebook, and others for allegedly censoring conservative content. President Trump issued an executive order back in May, ordering federal agencies to limit the applicability of Section 230. The FCC took up the cause. Their basic complaint is that these platforms are acting as publishers, not platforms. They shouldn't be allowed to alter or editorialize others' speech, and that they are in fact not acting in good faith. So the Republicans say doing too much. Democrats say not doing enough. They're attacking the platforms for failing to monitor and remove misleading and harmful content. Biden said back in January that he would eliminate Section 230. Too much, not enough, any middle ground? Well, as we said, with a lineup that we've got, perhaps. There may be an emerging consensus that the administration could support, basically calling for just greater clarity about sort of who makes the decisions, humans, algorithms, how is it made, what are the criteria, and is there an appeal and adjudication process if you disagree, and finally, what are the consequences for not following your own stated policy. The fourth area where I think you'll see a lot of activity, at least administratively, is data privacy. So add Biden's voice to the Democrats and many Republicans who call for a general federal privacy law. Everybody says they want it. The question is, what is it? And the same basic two issues remain between Democrats and Republicans: federal preemption and a private right of action. The Republicans don't want federal preemption, and so does industry, arguing that without it, you're just adding a federal bill to 50 state bills. They also want to preclude private rights of action. The Democrats don't want federal preemption. They'd rather see federal privacy law as a floor, not a ceiling, and they want to preserve private right of action. The trial lawyers are a pretty potent political force, and it's hard for me to see how Biden's election softens Democratic demands in this area. And for that reason, it's hard for me to see how we make legislative process. But I do think we can expect to see much more aggressive enforcement of current laws by the FTC. This is under their Section 5 authority to go after unfair and deceptive acts and practices. It is what they have been using for 20 plus years to go after companies' privacy and data security problems. And I also expect them to be working much more closely with state Democratic attorneys general. And the fifth area to just highlight is potential limitations on the permissibility of end user encryption. Now, this is encryption where only the user has the key, not other people. The FTC recently settled just the last couple of days with Zoom, which claimed that it had been using end user encryption when it hadn't been, and now it says that it will be going forward. Now recall that Trump, Barr, and Lindsey Graham sort of formed an unholy trinity, and all were seeking to prevent the use of what they would call warrant-proof encryption. The so-called Earn It Act, or the Law Enforcement Access to Encrypted Data Act, would effectively stop the use of end user encryption. But, you say, doesn't Biden support the use of encryption? Well, actually, at least when he was chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, no. He actually introduced bills calling for that called for both ISPs and manufacturers to ensure that the government could have access to plain text. So I think this is an area, it's not on the headlines now, but I think we remain only one terrorist incident away from it coming front and center full force. And the danger is this is certainly an area where you could see legislation, legislating in haste and repenting in leisure. So with that, because I don't want to be a Debbie Downer the whole time here, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Paul Steimers, who's going to talk about some of the upsides on an investment and spending in areas. Paul?
Thanks
Paul,
very
just
much.
before you start, please, let me remind everyone that while it's on your mind, you can go to the chat line and ask questions. As we go through the different speakers.
Yeah, and please ask Bruce the difficult ones. Thank you. So I'm Paul Steimers. I've been with K&L Gates for 18 years. I'm a partner in the policy group, and I focus on emerging and disruptive technologies, including artificial intelligence, quantum technologies, and commercial spaceflight. Among other things, I founded and am the executive director of the Quantum Industry Coalition. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the prospects for AI, quantum technologies, and space in a Biden administration. So artificial intelligence currently is one of the 5 industries of the future identified by the Trump administration for special focus. And in August, the administration announced approximately $500 million in funding for AI, including about $140 million over 5 years for 7 National Science Foundation-led AI research centers, along with more than $300 million in AI research awards that are expected to be announced by next summer. This has been part of a plan to roughly double non-defense AI research funding, spending more than $2 billion on AI by 2022. And we're expecting that a Biden administration would continue on this route. The campaign has called for more than $300 billion overall in new federal R&D programming, of which a group of breakthrough technologies would get the lion's share. Now, the campaign has identified AI as one of these breakthrough technologies. They've stated that the technologies of the future, this is a quote, the technologies of the future, like AI, are bound by law and ethics and promote greater shared prosperity and democracy. Part of what we think they mean by that is that we'll need to watch for activity related to the question of how AI is used, and in particular looking at things like implicit bias in AI. We've seen some preliminary indications that that's going to be an issue and is an issue already when we look at things like facial recognition, and we find that facial recognition works better in current circumstances for white faces than it does for faces of people of color. So we'll be keeping an eye on that, but we do anticipate that AI will continue to be a significant focus of a Biden administration, as it has been under the Trump administration. Similarly, with respect to quantum information science has been another of the 5 so-called industries of the future under the Trump administration. And as with AI, the Trump administration had been on track to spend nearly $1 billion by 2022 as it implemented the Bipartisan National Quantum Initiative Act, which the president signed into law in 2018. The National Quantum Initiative includes a network of NSF and Department of Energy centers, which a Biden administration is expected to continue implementing, continue funding, and move forward with. And on quantum, again, we're expecting to see both a scientific push toward quantum development as well as a military push. The Defense Department continues to coordinate closely with the Department of Energy and other science agencies to make sure that that quantum R&D proceeds at pace. We also expect, given the former Vice President's very personal experiences with cancer, that the president-elect, if he does take office, would continue a focus on cures, in particular cures for cancer, and use quantum and AI both as parts of moonshot efforts to deal with those diseases and illnesses. They have tremendous capabilities on that front, tremendous potential on that front, and we expect that to be an area of great personal importance to the president. He's spoken about that already. The other issue I'd call your attention to on quantum is that Senator Harris, when she first came to the Senate, one of her first bills was a quantum research and development bill. And so that's an issue that she's been a leader on from the moment she arrived on Capitol Hill. And I would expect to see her continuing to have a role on that front. We have noticed a strong interest on both fronts, both AI and quantum within industry, on immigration and export controls. There's a tremendous amount of work below the radar for the most part on both fronts with respect to addressing the need to bring in high-skilled leaders on the AI and quantum front while trying to prevent foreign agents, if you will, from coming to the United States, gathering information about our technology and our intellectual property, and bringing it back to their own countries to compete. We anticipate that a Biden administration would work with Congress to increase both high and low skilled immigration, but would also set limits on H-1B visas that are fairly strict. At the same time, we also expect that a Biden administration would be relatively quiet on export controls, less stringent, I think, than a Trump administration, but perhaps more so than the Obama administration. And we'll hear more about that, I expect, from Stacey later on. Finally, on space, the vice president, if he does become president, will be, I think, more focused on earth science and climate change than has previously been the case. It's likely that as those budgets increase within NASA, that the Artemis program to return to the moon will slow down, although it will not likely change. We will likely not have boots on the moon again in 2024, as is the current plan, which it must be said was a very ambitious plan. It's unclear how heavily a Biden administration will rely on commercial spaceflight. But on the other hand, certainly the Obama administration, with Vice President Biden in a significant role, helped put us on a commercial spaceflight path to begin with. And there is excuse me, a distinct possibility that a Biden administration could end the Space Launch System, the largest rocket ever built. As we look toward NASA, it's quite possible that a female NASA administrator would be named, the first female NASA administrator, and there's already a short list of names circulating there. We do expect that President Biden would keep the Space Force. We also expect that he would keep the National Space Council, although it's anybody's guess whether it will be as effective as the current National Space Council has been, which was a function of the personal interest that the president and vice president took in space policy. I'd like to turn it over to Mary Baker next to talk about taxes.
Thank you, Paul, and hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. As Bart would describe me, if you gave him 2 words to describe me, I think it would probably be tax nerd, and that is probably correct. I spent many years at the Internal Revenue Service in a variety of technical and senior management positions. Then I moved over to Senate Finance Committee and worked for Max Baucus before coming to K&L Gates, where I lead the tax policy practice and co-lead the opportunity zones practice. So as has been brought out on through the other speakers, what's going to happen on tax policy in 2021 under a Biden administration is going to depend on the composition of the Congress. If we have a 50-seat Democratic Senate with the vice president's vote, then Democrats will be able to use the budget reconciliation process or perhaps even set aside the filibuster to be able to kind of run the boards and execute their tax policy. Clearly, if Republicans are in control of the Senate and we have a mixed Congress, then we are going to be seeing an environment of negotiation and compromise. So we will probably be seeing far less extremes at either end of the political spectrum in what we see in the way of tax policy. But I think it's important to think about what is Biden's tax agenda, because even if Democrats don't control the Congress, his tax agenda is going to be the starting point for his budget proposals when the FY 2022 budget is put out. And it's going to be the starting point for discussions and proposals coming from the Congress. And there are a lot of proposals in both his agenda and also the House Republicans' commitment for growth in America, something like that, that are very similar to what Biden's tax agenda is. And I think both of them together really represent a commonality of interest in trying to move production to the United States or startups locating in the United States, and in disincentivizing companies from moving offshore, staying offshore, or starting up offshore. And the tech sector particularly will be affected by this because many of the operations of the tech sector are located outside the United States. So Biden's proposals are primarily taking a carrot and stick approach to tax policy. to kind of going along with what I said, to incentivize activity in the United States and disincentivize it from being outside the United States. Just generally speaking, kind of apart from his carrot and stick approach, he has proposed to raise the corporate tax rate from 21 to 28%. And he has also proposed to raise the individual tax rate, the highest rate, up to the old rate of 39.6%. So if you're talking about a pass-through entity, that's relevant. Let's stick on the corporate side a little bit. In addition to raising the marginal rate on corporations, he would also has proposed to double the minimum tax, the GILTI tax that was enacted as part of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, from 10.5% to 21%. And in addition to that, he not only would raise the rate on, and the GILTI tax applies to offshore earnings of CFCs, even though the tax reform bill got rid of our worldwide tax system, not entirely, because we still have this minimum tax on offshore earnings. In addition to raising the rate, he would take away what's known as, among us tax nerds, as the QBI, which is kind of a 10% base that whatever your foreign earnings are, you can take 10% off of that to determine what is taxable in the United States. He would take that away because it actually, some think that it serves as an incentive to locate your tangible property offshore to increase your QBI percentage and thus decrease the amount of your foreign income that's subject to US taxes. So he would get rid of that. He has also proposed a 10% surtax on products that are manufactured outside the United States and then brought back to the United States for sale. Again, trying to discourage production offshore that could take place in the United States. One of the things that's really causing our clients a lot of angst is his proposal to impose a book minimum tax. So even if you don't have taxable income tax based on the Internal Revenue Code, your book tax would be taxed at a rate of 15%. So that would hit a lot of companies that are not paying any US taxes based on the Internal Revenue Code, but for financial reporting purposes, book tax, it would be, and that could particularly affect the tech sector. He would apparently still keep the FDII deduction, which is a deduction to incentivize keeping research and production in the United States and selling products and services offshore. I've seen no proposal that would suggest that he would get rid of that. But what this describes is kind of a tension in my mind, and I can't entirely reconcile it in my mind because you're increasing corporate rates, you're increasing the highest individual rates, but those would seem to be a real disincentive for companies to stay in the United States. It seems like it would be an incentive for them to move offshore. So are all these sticks enough to overcome, are the burdens, do the benefits outweigh the burdens of staying in the United States, or are some of these sticks in the United States sufficient incentive to move offshore? There are other things that he would promote: clean energy, climate policies, renewable energy, energy storage in that energy sector, encouraging innovation. Another thing that I want to point out is that we should not assume that if we have a mixed Congress that we are not going to have the loophole problem. Loopholes are strictly defined as tax expenditures, but they are basically a benefit that a particular industry sector or line of business gets that is not available to everybody. And Congress is going to be looking for ways to pay down the debt, to pay for other policy, and therefore your favorite deduction and your favorite credit might be considered a loophole, and that could be on the chopping block to help provide a pay for these policies and other activities. So don't take your eye off the ball, because they are going to be out there and they're going to be very relevant. So if we have a mixed Congress and the Republicans are in charge of the Senate, does that just mean nothing gets done? Absolutely not. As I mentioned, the House has their Commitment to American Growth Act. The House Republicans, they have a lot of similar types of policies that I just described to incentivize activity in the United States and disincentivize activity outside the United States. So even though the policies may differ a little bit, they are common policies. And so they can work out the details, but I think that this is something that we should not overlook. We should not assume that there's not going to be legislation to try to encourage US economic growth and job creation in this country. Then finally, I would just mention that we can't look at the United States in a vacuum. We have a lot of activity going on at the OECD and in the EU and within individual jurisdictions within the EU, particularly on digital taxes. And many countries in the EU have already passed and are kind of on hold in implementing their digital taxes, waiting for the OECD to come up with a global solution to this. The United States has been somewhat of an outlier in the OECD discussion. Secretary Mnuchin has proposed that Pillar 1, which is nexus and allocation issues, to try to avoid a race to low tax jurisdictions. He has suggested that what's been proposed by 140 countries that are part of the OECD coalition would be more of a safe harbor and that the US wouldn't necessarily have to follow it. It's unclear whether a Biden administration would take that same approach, although taking a cue from the Obama administration was very much against ring fencing the digital economy and picking on them and i.e. US technology companies and digital companies for additional taxes. The other last point that I would make is that the GILTI tax that I just talked about, that Biden would double the tax. Pillar 2 of the OECD global framework would actually give a carve out for countries, the US, that is subject to GILTI taxes. So the US would kind of, although would be subject to Pillar 2, would have a carve out because they have the GILTI tax in place. But if the GILTI tax is changed, then that takes away that entire dynamic. It changes it entirely. So it's unclear how that would play out on the global stage with respect to Pillar 2. And then I lied. One more point I would make is that, as I think Bruce mentioned, the power of the executive pen, either through regulations or executive orders, we could, even with a mixed Congress, through executive orders, through revisiting some of the tax reform regulations that have already been promulgated, as well as new regulations that would be coming out based on new law. There's a huge amount of power in the executive branch to shape how tax laws are administered and implemented. With that, I will stop and I will turn it over to my excellent colleague, Stacey Ettinger, to talk about trade.
Thanks, Mary. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm happy to be here to talk about trade issues. I will have some general comments, sort of setting the stage for policy and approach in the Biden administration, and then talk about some of the specifics of interest, hopefully, to the tech community. So, again, looking at it from the big picture, I think Biden is going to move back to a rules-based trading system, and this is in contrast to unilateral action, basically. Now, one of the things that Biden inherits, and I call these sort of legacy protectionist measures, will include the and the constituencies that are supportive of those tariffs and kind of wedded to them. And I'll talk a little bit more about whether there's going to be tariff relief coming. Biden also will take an economic approach versus President Trump's national security rationale on trade issues. And I think that brings us back in line with, most of our trading partners that tend to think of trade issues not from a national security perspective. But that doesn't mean that, Biden's going to be as tough on China as President Trump as well. That's not going to change. There's just generally too much support across the board on a bipartisan basis related to China. And U.S. trade policy then is also going to shift from what I call the Trump transactional unilateralism to rebuilding relationships with trading partners. And the benefit from rebuilding and resetting those relationships is it allows the U.S. to build a coalition to work together to work on needed reform of international institutions like the World Trade Organization, to reinforce international rules. I think, from a tech industry perspective, I think one of the things that has been neglected for the past 4 years are global standard setting organizations. And I do think that as President Biden resets our relationships with trading partners, that there's an opportunity to focus on those organizations and to have a united voice with our trading partners in some of those very important, but, sort of techno, down in the weeds, standard setting organizations. In terms of China, I think that what's been missing is kind of an overarching plan on how to deal with China, an overarching sort of policy, particularly on technology trade, including technology trade protectionism. The United States under President Trump has again focused on this. The president has focused on this sort of transactional unilateralism. The result being that the U.S. has decoupled from China and has forced some businesses to, in a way, to avoid tariffs, to decouple from China. That has had the perverse effect of accelerating China's tech independence and growth. They are less connected to the United States and have used the opportunity to realize they can go it alone. And that's not necessarily a good place for the U.S. to be in. The other issue is the U.S.-China techno-nationalism. So, you see this growing back and forth of countries, say, refusal to import other countries' advanced technology, to limit exports, and to allow other countries to benefit from other countries' advanced technologies. This comes up in the context of export control limits. It comes up in, for example, the recent decision back in August by Commerce to restrict foreign semiconductor companies from selling chips developed or produced using U.S. software or technology to Huawei. So, it is making connections that weren't necessarily made for purposes of this techno-nationalism that has unintended consequences. The TikTok and WeChat issues, I think that, it raises the interesting issue of a need for a framework to look at issues related to protecting the privacy and security of U.S. citizens' data and communications, and also a framework to assess foreign applications, apps, the risks from those apps, and are there ways to mediate those risks? And I look forward to, in the Biden administration, sort of a thoughtful process for addressing those issues. My colleague Paul had said earlier that he thought there'd be less, the U.S. might be less strict on export controls under President Biden. I think there might be, well, I don't necessarily agree. I think there won't be much change. I think that export controls are going to be a tool that the Biden administration is not going to walk away from. There may be some, perhaps more thought and consideration and work with affected industries in the lead up to announcing any new export controls, but I don't see any changes other than perhaps more coordination with our allies. The Biden economic agenda and the issue of tariffs, the imposition of tariffs and sort of unilateral actions has resulted in shifting of supply chains. I think President Trump had hoped and wanted those supply chains to reshore, to come back to the United States. That has happened some, but more often than not, those supply chains have simply shifted out of China to other Asian countries, Vietnam and Thailand and Malaysia. And again, one of the sort of odd side effects is that even those new companies, as manufacturing was set up in those other Asian countries, many of those new manufacturing facilities are actually Chinese owned and in fact staffed by Chinese workers. we heard a little bit about the Biden is going to, be a big push for Buy American provisions and a real focus on sourcing from U.S. Manufacturing or U.S. services. I think here there's opportunities for the tech industry to think about this issue and how they can get out in front of this. If there's going to be a big Recovery Act, there will be opportunities to perhaps try and steer federal funding in a way to specific industries that are either doing, R&D in the United States or are manufacturing in the United States. And I think there's some opportunities there. On the tariff issue, I don't think there'll be a wholesale reduction or elimination of the tariffs that President Trump has put in place. The one area where there may be possible relief, and I think this is beneficial to tech and electronics industries, is on the China tariffs. There is a lawsuit that is at the early stages at the Court of International Trade that has close to 4,000 plaintiffs, and it's challenging the tariffs on products that are on lists 3 and 4A. And so those are more commercial products and covering electronics. And it is possible that, again, this litigation is at an early stage. So a new administration will perhaps want to consider settling this rather than attempt to defend the Trump administration's decision to expand the imposition of tariffs to imports from China that go beyond the original stated purpose of the investigation that led the President Trump to take action. The initial focus was on products that were in sectors identified by China for growth in their own manufacturing, what we call the Made in China 2025 plan. And List 1 and List 2 really were focused on products that were in those sectors. But once we got beyond that, it just basically covered everything else. Last 2 points of CFIUS. I think that there will not necessarily be a huge change in how the U.S. government looks at foreign investment. The aggressive review of foreign investment, particularly as it relates to Chinese firms, will continue. I think there will be a continuation of reviewing completed deals that did not go through CFIUS review. For example, the review of ByteDance's purchase of TikTok ultimately, and the decision now that ByteDance needs to divest from TikTok. So China will be a main focus, but they will be looking at other countries, and they've already started to do that. And again, these are completed deals that are getting a review for the first time. There will be more coordination on foreign investment issues with our allies. And I think the interesting thing here is perhaps a continued expansion of the reach of CFIUS and of U.S.'s review of foreign investment. For example, if you have a Chinese investor in a European company that's based in Europe, but that European company has a footprint in the United States, I think the U.S. has in the past, but will continue to get involved in those transactions, and that'll have an impact. Something to think about in the long term. And last but not least, sanctions issues. Again, I don't think a Biden administration is going to back off on any of these issues. I do think, well, maybe Cuba, but with respect to Iran, I think there's a desire to potentially rejoin the nuclear accord. There's probably some additional push on China and Russia, in contrast to the Trump administration. I think maybe a Biden administration is going to focus on human rights concerns. And with respect to Russia, maybe even focus on the allegations of poisoning of various officials in Russia and the sort of reach of those efforts. Anyway, thank you very much, and hopefully we have time for some questions.
Well, as you might have guessed, Stacey has a good background in trade. She didn't credential herself, but she had a good career at USTR and then was Chuck Schumer's special counsel on trade. And Mary, she gave you a run for the Geek Award, but you're still our #1 geek. So let me go to the chat line. And this question, this is for you, Bruce. Is significant antitrust reform in keeping with the House Judiciary Report dead with the Republican Senate? And can a lot be done by executive actions?
Thanks, Bart. So I don't think it's that dead in a Republican Senate. I mean, I think the strain of Republican populism, I think Mike Lee or Hawley or Cruz, I mean, is still pretty still. Lindsey Graham is pretty strong. I think the question is, you're not going to see, I think necessarily, I don't think under Republican Senate, big tech is bad per se. But again, the focus is on conduct. And I think you could see some action there. Certainly, though, through, I think the second part of the question was enforcement. And, through lawsuits, as I said, I think you will see an aggressive enforcement action by the Biden administration. And I think you will see coordination, much as you did under Trump with Republicans, with Democrat attorneys general.
I'm still waiting for more questions on the chat line. As we do that, I'll give our panelists a heads up. I'm going to ask you, what do you see some of the early executive orders to be in your area? And I'll give a little bit of foundation for that. The House and Senate will be sworn in over 2 weeks before the new president. Nancy Pelosi earlier said that it was her ambition to pass a number of bills that can be on the president's desk for signing when he gets there. The uncertainty of the Senate probably, takes that out. However, I do foresee that she'll be passing some legislation in a message sense through the House. And so that then goes to what will potentially President-elect Biden do. I think he's going to use some of those early executive orders to say thank you to the progressive wing, so that he then can become, more in a compromising mood for other things. So you're going to see climate, social justice, immigration, and I think some labor reform be those early executive orders as a bone and good policy to the progressives, so that he then can get down to the deal making. So why don't we go to Jeff? Are you predicting?
I missed the question, Bart. You muted the last part of it.
Okay. What executive orders would you be predicting that a future President Biden might do in his first week or two in office?
Well, under my theatrical lighting that I have here going on in my house right now, let me just say I do think that there's a few. The Great Outdoors Act, I think, moved the country forward. There could be certainly some expansion of that or implementation of it in a more aggressive manner. And I think he could do some of that by executive order. I think the jury's still out on what happens with our energy sector. There was a lot of talk going both ways on an energy executive order. There was certainly talk about fracking, and then there was talk about phasing out petroleum. So I would expect to see some type of executive order in that arena.
Mary, since there's likely, well, I won't say likely, without reconciliation, it's going to be very difficult to get any kind of significant tax bills passed. What can the president do in your area through executive order?
Now, I would expect that one of the things that Biden would be looking at early on would be something you might not think about as a tax issue, but the ACA, the Affordable Care Act. President Trump and the administration have dismantled a good part of the ACA through executive actions. And while you don't think about healthcare as being taxed, it is. For example, the individual mandate is a tax. If you didn't buy insurance, then you had a tax imposed on you. And there were other tax mechanisms built into the ACA largely as revenue raisers that have been kind of unraveled along with more of the ACA. So those would be things that could, if they were unwound through executive orders, possibly could be reinstated through executive orders. One thing that I think is important to consider is that even it's not as simple as the stroke of a pen to just reverse things. And it's like you woke up like on Dallas and you were just in a dream for a while. The infrastructure at the agencies has been unwound to be able to enforce some of those things. So it will take a while to ramp back up, even through the use of executive order, to be able to get those things back online. I think another issue that would be under consideration would be President Trump had authorized a payroll deferral, the FICA taxes on individuals, which was really primarily taken up only by the federal government. But there's going to be a lot of pressure on Democrats to forgive those deferred payroll taxes because they're anticipating a lot of people that have enjoyed the deferral have not been banking that money to be able to pay it back, which is required during the first quarter of 2021. So that would be another consideration. I think that he would consider doing something about that to provide some relief for the individuals that had that deferral and now are going to be in a position to have to pay it back. The rub is going to be for all the other employees of the world who did not get the deferral, and then all of a sudden, the federal employees get it forgiven. That kind of smacks of a little inequity. So that's the tension in that situation. But that was a pretty unpopular executive order, and as I said, because of the federal employees largely being Democrats, there's going to be a lot of pressure on Democrats to do something about that.
Mary, that also brings up rolling back some of the rules that were promulgated. As we know, President Trump rolled back many of President Obama's rules, and it's to be expected that President Biden would do the same. However, as you said, you don't just do it with a flash of the pen. If you want it to last, you have to promulgate those rules going through the proper process and having it documented. So a lot of these things won't be done overnight. I'm getting a message from Stacy. She's blaming a foreign government, but she says that she has technological failure. So hopefully that will get corrected. And so, Bruce, we'll go to you. And what do you see could be some executive orders early on?
Yeah, so I'll answer that in a minute. I just want to elaborate a bit on what you said, Bart. A lot of the Democrats were talking about using the Congressional Review Act to more quickly overturn a lot of the Trump regulations, particularly in this latter part. Well, that's obviously not going to happen if the Senate stays Republican. So to your point about executive actions, I actually don't know if sort of a week 1, week 2 kind of executive orders in tech are likely. I mean, on competition policy, I don't think Biden is going to want to start directing DOJ, having been critical of the Trump administration on that. I think both net neutrality at the FCC and data privacy at the FTC may depend first on appointing, who he wants as chairs and or new commissioners there. Encryption's not on the burner. So I think the one area that might happen is a section on Section 230, where he could seek to reverse what it is that could reverse the executive order that Trump put out. The question is what he would say instead. And so that I think will be the question. Again, I don't think any of these are sort of the headline issues right now that may consume him during his first week or two. I will also say on immigration, people do say that a day one issue will be something on DACA. But H-1Bs becomes much more complicated when he has to balance the technology industry's desire to have them against organized labor's opposition to them. And so that's more of a thread the needle. And so I don't expect that to be happening, in the first couple of weeks. I think Stacy's back.
Yeah, Stacy's back with us. So, Stacy, what are your questions? And then we'll let Paul finish up.
Okay, thanks. There was no technical difficulty. Sorry about that. Misinformation. Anyway, in the sort of trade world, I think it's unlikely to be executive orders sort of out of the starting gate, but I do think perhaps further down the line, I think that the Biden administration will review all of the various tariffs that are in place, all of the unilateral actions, and we'll do a thorough review of those. And at some point, we'll make a decision on whether to roll those back. And those would all require executive orders to roll them back. And again, I think that it will take a while, and it's certainly not going to happen, right out of the box.
The chat line is still open, but Paul, why don't you make
Sure. Like Bruce, I don't think that we're going to see too much in the way of executive orders on quantum or AI right out of the gate. The one quantum executive order that President Trump signed was just to create a national quantum initiative advisory council pursuant to the National Quantum Initiative Act. On space, though, I think we might see that President Biden would continue President Trump's practice of issuing space policy directives. The president has issued several of those. They've been very successful in helping chart a course forward on space, both military and civil. So it's entirely likely that President Biden would continue that, especially if he's continuing the National Space Council.
Jeff, you are a veteran of the Transportation Committee, and you had mentioned that there would be an infrastructure bill, and not just an infrastructure bill, but a big infrastructure bill covering, the traditional roads and bridges, but broadband and maybe schools. That's what everyone would like, and that's what everyone would have liked for some time. But it gets down to spending. Are we at a point now where Democrats and Republicans would say that it's part of a stimulus or a COVID bill to get the economy going again, and would pass a big bill that wasn't completely paid for? Or what's your thoughts on that?
I think it's going to be hard to find pay-fors for even a modest bill. And I think the appetite in the Senate is dwindling on having a big COVID bill. I think where we're starting to converge is seeing a stimulus bill that is both COVID and infrastructure, that is not fully paid for, but does do the job of creating jobs and getting our economy moving again. It's probably a once in a lifetime opportunity to be able to address some of the big things that haven't been addressed in decades, and get people back to work at the same time.
Let me just jump in and add to that. I do think as part of that, as Jeff said, it's both infrastructure and innovation. A big part of that will be funding for rural broadband. The lead in the House is Majority Whip Clyburn, and there is no person in the country who can claim, I think, greater credit for making Joe Biden president than Jim Clyburn. And he's been the lead. He's been pushing a $20 billion bill in terms of funding that would also let municipalities own and operate their own networks if private companies are not. And I would expect to see some progress on that. As I said, I think the COVID epidemic and the pandemic and the increase in the digital divide has amplified that issue.
We have a question here. What about 5G as a new frontier, or dealing with the Fed investment in FiOS? What were appropriated by the private companies but stopped short? That were appropriated by private companies but stopped short. Jeff, do you see going that far?
I don't, but I'm not sure that the whole 5G, while it was defined in the House, there's certainly not agreement in the Senate, and I think the administration, incoming administration, will have something to say about it.
Yeah, let me just say, so this is one area where I think the Biden administration will not advance a national 5G network, as some in the Trump administration have proposed. I think in terms of what one can do to stimulate 5G, as the movie title, well, the movie said, it's complicated. You have to, there's additional spectrum that does need to be allocated. I think the Trump administration has basically tried to buy the U.S. and Europe some time by its imposition of restrictions on Huawei under national security guise to try to slow up what was a pretty relentless march. I think there's been some progress on the industry side by coming together to try to adopt a more software focused approach that doesn't rely on proprietary hardware to try to jumpstart that and come up with some common standards. So this is an area where I think government can help steer, but industry's got to do a lot as well. Bart, you're muted.
Excuse me. Okay. Somewhere on that line, Bruce, what changes will be made to regulatory overview to avoid log jams?
I think this may be a reference back to the Congressional Review Act. I don't think you're going to, the law is what it is, and you're not going to see a Republican Senate go along with easing those regulatory review requirements, I would think.
I would add on the tax front that one of the changes made under the Trump administration was that the OMB OIRA office reviews most of the major Treasury regulations, and they didn't used to do that. And so that would be one way to possibly cut through the red tape a little bit, would be to bypass, to cut a new memorandum of understanding with OMB on tax regulations, which have always enjoyed sort of a special status that they were not subject to the same levels of review as certain other regulations coming out of the executive branch.
Okay, panelists, any final words?
My prediction continues to come closer and closer. They just announced 2 more seats. Michelle Steele just won in Orange County, California, and Beth Van Dyne won in Texas.
Okay, so I think that one thing that we've accomplished today is we have, I guess, solidified our reputation as being a law firm of nerds, and I hope everyone has appreciated the deep knowledge that our panelists has demonstrated. We're glad you could join us, and we will be back in touch with any additional information in this area. So thank you again, and we're going to close just on time.